Welcome back. Thank you again for joining me. My name is Anakin, of course. We're in week 2 of the session, and in week 1, we actually got familiar with the basics in Tekken, and we kind of went through the things that you needed to know as a day 1 player to kind of get started with the game. So if you have not checked out episode 1 covering the basics, please, I recommend you go back and watch that so you do not fall behind. Because this week, we're actually going to jump into an actual match of Tekken, real combat situations during a real match, and you'll get your first glimpse of what it's like to actually play another person in Tekken. Alright guys, so the first thing I want to let you know is that even though it's super tempting, I want you guys to refrain from just randomly button mashing and throwing out attacks as much as possible. You wouldn't see like a boxer or a mixed martial artist just flailing their arms and throwing random kicks around the ring, so you don't want to do that in Tekken either. I'm going to give you guys some basic tips and things that you need to know so that you don't have to resort to button mashing. I'd like to start off by talking to you guys a little more about what I introduced to you in week 1, which are the different types of moves that are available to you at any given time. Since characters can possess up to over 100 moves, it kind of makes it impossible for a beginner to jump right in and use every attack and know what they're doing. The big secret here is that you're actually never going to have to use every single attack that your character possesses in a match. In fact, you usually really only need to start off learning about 10-15 moves to use, maybe even less. In part 1, you guys learned about all your different attacks being either highs, mids, or lows. Now, while that's the most basic categorization that you can make for your attacks, you can kind of take it one step further and kind of differentiate them from another by looking at the more obvious features. For example, how much life does the attack take? Is it a faster or slower attack? Is it part of a bigger string, or is it just a singular attack? That's also something that we talked about last week. What happens to the opponent when I land the attack on them? And this is especially important because some attacks, when you connect, they pop the opponent up in the air for a big combo, or sometimes you knock the opponent down far away. And so it's good to know what tools you have so that you can pick the right one for the right job. Ultimately, the goal is to try to take this knowledge that you've acquired about different attack characteristics and take that into practice mode. If you're having a hard time with an opponent's move, for example, I'm having trouble with Kazuya's sweep, you can definitely take that into practice mode and find that attack's weakness. Almost every attack in Tekken has a weakness or a way to get around it. You just have to find it. Let's say you find yourself in a match and you lose a lot of life. You'll often notice that your life bar turns red. This means that you've activated Rage Mode. And Rage Mode is just a mechanic that helps a player make comebacks, essentially. You get access to a couple more attacks and your character is gonna deal a little bit more damage. You can exhaust your Rage Mode to go for a Rage Art, which is a heavy damage cinematic attack that is often either used at the end of combos or sometimes used as a last-ditch comeback attempt. But be careful though, because if your opponent manages to block your Rage Art, you leave yourself open to big damage counterattacks. So with great reward comes great risk. So the other attack that you have available when in Rage Mode is called the Rage Drive. And it's often considered to be a better option than Rage Art just because it's not as risky as using Rage Art. A lot of times, whether or not you land the Rage Drive or whether your opponent blocks the Rage Drive, you're going to be putting yourself in a really good position to continue applying pressure. The Rage Drive is a really good tool to use to make those last minute comebacks, and because of that, you can only get one per round. So now that you have all this knowledge about your different attacks and your different tools at your disposal, how do you know when to actually use them in a match? What should you be looking for? What should you be thinking? A lot of that is going to depend on the distance between you or your opponent, aka the ranges. The first range I want to talk to you guys about is the close range, and you're considered within close range of your opponent when a majority of your attacks will land if you were to throw them out. And this actually includes at the very start of the round when the announcer goes round 1 fight. So at close range, you kind of want to be ready to defend or deal with a lot of attacks. You're going to want to rely more on your fastest attacks at the close range just because they tend to beat out the opponents who are going to use bigger, flashier, slower attacks. So starting off, your fastest high attacks up close are going to be your basic jab attacks, aka just pressing the one punch. Connecting with a jab is just a really good way to get offense started, just because it's often the fastest attack that you have and it recovers really fast. So jabs are very versatile and can be used in many different situations. So you want to try to use this early and often because it's a really good tool. So you're also going to want to mix in a few good low attacks to throw at your opponent and slowly chip away their life bar, because close range is going to be where your low attacks are most effective. And your opponent's likely not going to be guarding low up close just because of the threat of being hit by all the other attacks in the game. And to go along with that, you want to add in quick mid pokes as well. And the best mid poke is performed by doing down forward and one at the same time. And now, while there are a few exceptions to this rule, that's going to be true for just about every single character in the game. And the reason why mid pokes are good to pair along with low attacks is that they keep the opponent guessing. They're not sure on whether or not they should be guarding you in crouching or standing, so you'll want to just mix up mids and lows effectively. So with that said, all the different things going on at close range, throws become a bigger threat just because you're right there next to the opponent. You'll want to stay on your toes at all times and be ready to appropriately react and counter to the things that your opponent does. And that sounds really, really tough, but trust me, with a little bit of practice, you guys can do it. Players enter the mid-range when they're both fairly spaced out and it's uncertain as to whether or not your attack or their attack will land if they were to throw it out. Both players are essentially jockeying for position, trying to get that first hit from a neutral position. For example, if you think the enemy is going to go in for an attack, you can take one dash back, they might miss the attack, and you can kind of go for a counter. Or if you think the opponent is going to sit back and let you make the first move, you can kind of dash in and get something started from that neutral position. Fighting at mid-range requires you to utilize movement to walk around the stage and find better positioning, and that's a little bit more of an advanced topic that I'm going to cover next week. So at the long range, this is where not many attacks will pose a threat. This is where there's going to be a lot of distance between you and your opponent, and you're going to have a little bit more time to think about what you're going to go for next. But you'll also want to be careful here because you don't want to back up too far to where you're putting yourself against the wall. I do agree it's nice to get a little bit of breathing room when you're fighting, but sooner or later you're going to have to jump in and make something happen. And as a beginner, it's just good to know about your close range, long range, and mid-range attacks, just so that you don't find yourself going for, say, short range poking attacks when you and your opponent are super spaced out from one another. You're going to want to find the right attack for the right ranges at the right times, and that's going to be really hard sometimes just because both players are going to be constantly moving during a match. But once again, practice makes perfect. Another type of position that a player could be in that doesn't really fall under close, mid, or long range is being grounded or knocked to the ground. It's just good in general to score knockdowns on your opponent so that while they spend time recovering, getting off the ground, you can reposition yourself to the close range and apply pressure once they get on their feet. However, the opponent can also perform attacks while getting up off the ground, and the most common attacks you're going to see are the low kick, the mid kick, as well as the spring kick. And there are a few more other options the player has available to them while they're in a grounded position, but we'll talk about that more later. So the most important thing you'll learn this week is called punishing, and punishing is exactly what it sounds like. You're capitalizing off your opponent's offensive mistakes by landing guaranteed hits after successfully defending against theirs. In week 1, I stressed the importance of getting used to always holding back to block. And the reason for this is because after blocking a handful of enemy attacks, there's going to be a brief window of opportunity for you to block punish the enemy. This prevents your opponent from just throwing stuff at you without really any consequence. And in order to effectively block punish, you're going to have to perform your attacks fast enough before the opponent can recover and guard. Not all attacks are going to be punishable, and the ones that aren't are going to be considered safe. And since jabs are your fastest attacks, I'd recommend trying to punish with jabs when starting off so that you can keep it simple.
And if all else fails, take it to the punishment training tool in practice mode, break those attacks down, and find their weaknesses.
The other type of punishing is called whiff punishing, and this happens when your opponent misses their attack completely. And when your opponent whiffs an attack, they spend a lot longer recovering than if you were to block that attack. So if you're fast enough, sometimes you can land really, really big launchers for combo damage. Keep in mind that when you're unable to punish your opponents for their mistakes, you miss out on valuable opportunities to secure free damage. Try your best not to let your opponent get off easy by letting punishes slip away. If you're having a hard time dealing with an attack that your opponent's using a lot, you should try to see if it's at least block punishable with your jabs. And what this is going to do is this is going to prevent them from abusing attacks over and over that they shouldn't. And if all else fails, you know, just take it to practice mode, break those attacks down, and find their weaknesses. Alright guys, so to wrap things up, today I threw a lot of knowledge regarding basic combat at you, and if you feel like you need to go back and re-watch a little bit, maybe break the lesson down into pieces one at a time, feel free to do that. But just like last week, got some homework for you. Remember, I'm going to be covering today's lesson a little more in depth on my upcoming Twitch stream. But in the meantime, if you guys have any questions at all, please feel free to tweet at me at TK Anakin. I'm more than happy to help. Once again, thank you very much for watching this week's episodes. And until next time, peace.